Steph?
Leah?
Jess?
Is this line secure?
Hi, everyone. I'm Stephanie Carvin.
I'm Jessica Davis.
And I'm Leah West.
Well, that was something. The last week, and to timestamp this, we are recording on the afternoon of February 4th, has been wild, with imminent fears that Canada would be subject to a whopping 25% tariff on all of its exports, with, of course, only 10% on oil, alongside Mexico, our USMCA or CUSMA partner. At the last minute, US President Donald Trump and Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau came to an agreement suspending the feared tariffs for 30 days, much to the relief of Canadians and the markets. Now, to be clear, we don't know much about how the deal was made and whether it will stick. But what we are here to talk about today on our first ever Podmergency episode is the arrangement that seemed to satisfy Trump. A $1.3 billion package that was, let's face it, mostly outlined in December 2024, with a couple of new, potentially significant add-ons. All three of us are here to talk about these developments. So, hi, guys.
Hi, Steph.
Hi. I'm tired.
Well, a well-earned tired. I think we are exhausted as a nation. Oh, Canada, like with the emphasis on the O, as in everyone's yawning. Has a yawning face. So we're here to talk about some of the national security elements of what happened over the last, say, 72 hours. We have this $1.3 billion border plan, which had been previously announced. But I think we need to point out that all of the things in that original December 2024 announcement were not actually funded because of the prorogation, right? Like they weren't actually getting going. So, of course, in that original package, there were helicopters, there were more people. I think 10,000 people are going to be at the border. There's going to be more dogs. They talked about doing more things at the port of entries, all of that kind of stuff. And then there were some new things as well, appointing a fentanyl czar. We don't really do czars in this country, but, a czar it is. We're going to be listing cartels as terrorist organizations, more watching the border 24/7, launching a joint Canada-U.S. strike force to target organized crime, fentanyl, and money laundering, and signing a new intelligence directive on organized crime and fentanyl backed by $200 million. So out of that package, is there anything that stands out to you?
Yeah, a couple, and I know we'll get into it in more detail. But firstly, why are we not watching the border 24/7? Do we go to bed and we're like, it's fine?
Yeah,
It's
is this
fine.
new?
So that
it raises more questions than answers.
Really. The second one for me is, what is an intelligence directive? A term I've never heard of. And the last one, I think I just want to make a clarification, is that Prime Minister Trudeau in his tweet or X or whatever we call it, said that it would be 10,000 frontline personnel working on the problems on the border.
Right.
So,
okay. That's a good clarification.
Unlike in the Mexican context, where it was the deployment of 10,000 troops to the border, which is a very different situation. It's like we've got 10,000 frontline personnel, a very amorphous term, that are going to be working on this problem. So I don't think we're going to all of a sudden see 10,000 people at the border.
I mean, I'm not sure where we put them.
They could hold hands along the border.
That'd be kind of nice. Seems very, very Canadian. Jess, what stood out for you, if anything? And I know we're going to get into the details, but what was your immediate reaction?
We're already doing all of this, was my immediate reaction.
But don't tell the Americans this.
Right, we don't say that out loud.
Right, it's a quiet part.
Yeah, to a lesser and greater extent. The one thing that did strike me, in addition to what Leah was saying, is that there might be, and it really pains me to say this, a slight possibility that we're going to get a little better on counter illicit finance because of this. I hate to give any credit to this tariff nonsense.
Can we get worse?
Could we get worse? Oh, we can always get worse, Leah.
Okay, oh, sorry.
But this idea that there could be new intelligence on organized crime and fentanyl that could have money attached to it, I'm cautiously hopeful that maybe there's going to be something there. Because, just to remind everyone, the Liberals, part of their platform was to actually create a Canadian Financial Crimes Agency, which they have not done over the course of their mandate. We haven't really made a lot of inroads in terms of combating our illicit finance problems writ large, in terms of sanctions evasion, money laundering, all of that kind of stuff. And so part of me is just ever the optimist, hopeful that this is maybe the time we're going to do something.
Okay, so let's step back just a minute here. And Leah, how I think it's worth discussing how we got here in the first place, because President Trump just didn't decide to put sanctions on and just declare, okay, now we're going to do sanctions. He had to do so under some kind of legislative framework. I mean, surprise, surprise, you actually do need a legislative framework, and it's a national security framework, I believe.
Yes, and even more an international framework. We could go all the way back to Bretton Woods if we wanted to, talk about where this really started, but
Love a Cold War throwback.
nobody wants to do that. So essentially, there's a international, a trilateral, and a domestic legal element to all of this. The international one, not so important in this context. So we do have the World Trade Organization's General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade here that basically protects free trade amongst the parties to the GATT and limits the ability of states to impose tariffs on parties, but for in situations of essential security interests or national security. There's that element. CUSMA, or the USMCA, again creates a trinational trading relationship per a treaty signed by Canada, the US, and Mexico. These tariffs violate, in all manner of respects, that treaty. And the only potential justification that the US would have for violating the treaty is, again, if it was in the United States' essential security interests. And thirdly, the US domestic law, which allows Trump to impose tariffs, because remember, tariffs are essentially taxes on his own people. Generally, in the United States, presidents aren't allowed to just impose taxes on their people without going through Congress. And so there is the fun to say IEPA, which is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which does arguably, but this is again arguably, give the president the capacity to impose tariffs when he declares a national emergency and it's necessary on that front. And I am not an expert on US trade law, but that argument in itself has been questioned. And I implore people to go and look at the Lawfare posts discussing this issue. But essentially, this claim of national emergency or essential security is necessary to, at all levels, allow Trump to actually impose tariffs. Now, Trump, we know, likes tariffs. He has thrown out all kinds of different reasons for wanting to impose tariffs on Canada and Mexico. But the ones he's been hanging his hat on, and the one that you hear from his commerce advisor, for example, where they stick more closely to the legal argument, is this idea of illegal migration and fentanyl. So that is the justification for this national emergency and the ability to violate both international and trilateral treaties with respect to trade, so that basically he can open the window to impose tariffs on Canada. So that's why these tariffs are associated with some sort of need to secure the border, even if no one really believes that's what Trump was after when it comes to at least Canada.
Right. So exactly. So he had to have some kind of national security justification in order to do this. So when we point out, only 19 kilograms of fentanyl across the border last year, or 2023, that's not an emergency. It doesn't matter. He can declare an emergency as president.
Right. And so that's why the response from Canada had to mirror his demands with respect to national security. So, we're not agreeing to, increase costs of softwood lumber, we're agreeing to create a fentanyl czar.
Right. Okay. So I think that kind of dovetails very nicely into the question I want to direct to you, Jess, which is, okay, what is the state of this emergency? Emergency. I mean, look, I saw a lot of people kind of making fun of the idea of fentanyl. They do, and I just did point it to the fact it's only 19 kilograms. But that's not to say we don't have a problem in Canada with organized crime, with fentanyl, with money laundering. You have made a career out of pointing these things out and have beaten that drum for a long time, as well as pointing out the deficiencies that we have in addressing these issues. So I was kind of wondering if you could offer an overview, like what is the landscape of the problems we're facing when it comes to these issues?
So you're right about the amount of fentanyl going across the border into the United States. I think the thing that's missing from this conversation, though, is that there is domestic production that's happening, and it's a lot of it's happening in BC and possibly and likely serving markets across Canada. And like I would say that any fentanyl production in Canada is a problem, right? Like I think we would all agree that this is not a good, as we were discussing before. It's not like the money being generated by these criminal activities is creating lunch programs or something. These are criminals profiting from a really nasty drug. But I think the big thing that's happening in Canada beyond like the production of some fentanyl for domestic consumption is the money associated with organized criminal activity, cartels, and illicit drugs and other illicit activities. A lot of that money is being laundered in and through Canada. And I think that's where a lot of the problems come from. Like when we look at the recent fines against TD Bank in the United States and then also here in Canada, a lot of that was related to organized criminal activity and drug trafficking.
Right. And so to maybe get to the point, do you find what is suggested here? I mean, it's just a list, kind of a bullet pointed list. We don't have a huge amount of details, but do you find that what is being proposed is going to address these issues?
I mean, without more details, there's really no way to know. Um, the thing that I think is really interesting, though, is this whole idea of an intelligence directive on organized crime and fentanyl with money attached to it. And I know Leah wants to talk about what is an intelligence directive because that does not really exist in
What
our
is
party.
it? I don't know.
Well, no one knows because, again, there's been no clarification. I think it might be one of two things. The prime minister could be referring to an intelligence priority, but there are already intelligence priorities on this issue. There's one on organized crime and there's one on illicit finance. So, again, already doing stuff on that front. The other one could be a ministerial directive directing departments or agencies to do particular types of collection. And I think we're probably in the second scenario here, but that's just really
Can I offer our third hypothesis?
absolutely.
I think intelligence directive is actually American language. I think this entire
Yeah, absolutely.
all the language the prime minister is using,
It's
czar,
100%
intelligence
American
directive.
language.
They're clearly marketing this to the US. So yeah, there is no intelligence, no such thing as an intelligence directive in Canada, but I strongly suspect that they are mirroring US language so that they are being as clear as possible. Yes, this is how we're taking action on these particular things. So that's
Right,
my hypothesis.
But then we have to translate it into what that actually means in Canada. And I think in this
It
context,
means vibes.
yeah, I think it's more than, I hope it's more than vibes. Anyways, well,
200 mil for vibes is like a lot.
It is. Or in the case of an intelligence agency, they might say it's actually not very much at all. Please give us more, depending on how strong those vibes are. So let's maybe get then to that. So to that intelligence directive that maybe does or doesn't exist. One of the things it talks about, at least, so to be clear to our listeners, there was a lot of this stuff was announced again in December 2024, and I was kind of looking at that announcement as kind of a basis for trying to understand the issues for this podcast. And at that time, they talk about giving resources to the RCMP and the CSE, the Communication Security Establishment, or cyber spies, to do some of this work, and they use the term targeting transnational crime. How does that work? How does that work in practice? Like, to be clear, and I'm not the lawyer here at all. The CSE cannot target people in Canada unless it's working under its assistance mandate to help another organization. So potentially the CSE might be helping if the RCMP got a warrant from a judge and requested the CSE's help. But like, how do you think this is going to work in practice?
So you're right. I think most directly it'll be through the assistance mandate. So if the RCMP is putting more emphasis on the investigation of transnational organized crime, then they will most likely require the assistance of CSE. We know, for example, that transnational organized crime rings like to use highly encrypted cell phones.
Can
Throwback to
add
Ortis.
that's a Cameron Ortis throwback.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
we'll talk about that some other time.
So you could see CSE assisting in that capacity if the RCMP didn't have it. You could also potentially see CSE just collecting foreign intelligence on this. That would fall in it. But again, then the intelligence itself needs to come from abroad and it needs to target non-Canadians. So you really are looking abroad, but that could include Mexico, for example, not the US, because we don't spy on them. Big no-no. And then it could also include offensive cyber capabilities, because
I was wondering, could we
we actually have seen CSC acknowledge that they have used offensive cyber capabilities against organized crime in the past.
Right. I think they were set up false websites that were misleading people with regards to COVID information as a way to like kind of steal money.
So they could be using, again, offensive cyber capabilities. The key here then, again, is it does have to be not Canadians and not inside Canada. But those are, powerful tools that CSC could be using to support law enforcement in this. It's not tools that they need an intelligent directive from, or whatever that is, or a ministerial directive to do.
They already have these powers.
They already can do it. I suspect Jess is going to say they already are doing it, but I guess this is the government, telling the intelligence agencies where its priorities are.
Yeah, just to throw back to that language from last year, they're talking about expanding these capabilities. So this is already stuff that's happening. But Leah, I do want to ask quickly about the intelligence to evidence issue, and we can all take a drink. Because in this hypothetical situation, and I know lawyers love a hypothetical, so I'll make you answer this. In the hypothetical that CSE is collecting foreign intelligence on, say, a professional money launderer operating out of Mexico, and then passes that information on, that intelligence rather, on to the RCMP. How does that work in terms of if they find connections in Canada?
Oh, it's a nightmare, especially for SIGINT. We always talk about CSIS and HUMINT, but SIGINT is even more touchy in terms of the need to protect it. And so I don't think you would actually ever see that be used as evidence in court. But again, I think the more likely scenario is CSE using its capacity in an assistance mandate. And then it can be privileged under both Section 37 and Section 38 in that context of the Canada-U.S. Acts.
Yeah, there is another way that it could potentially be useful. And I don't want to overplay the role of intelligence here because I want to talk about enforcement more in a minute. But, FINTRAC could use CSE intelligence as a lead for its database, and then use whatever it finds in its transactions to disclose to law enforcement. The caveat there being that I think that they would probably need to meet threshold for disclosure on their own without the SIGINT. So that means that, if they've got maybe Jessica Davis in SIGINT doing some professional money laundering, and then they find me in the database with a suspicious transaction report, then they can meet threshold without that SIGINT.
100%.
Meeting threshold without SIGINT, if there's no suspicious transaction report, I think is going to be a much more difficult thing. So like that, all of that maybe overstates the importance or the utility of SIGINT and this type of intelligence in actually combating this threat.
I do agree with that. Again, it's helpful. SIGINT can be useful when the agency it's shared with already has the capacity to collect on a specific person and it's narrowing their focus. But like you said, if the SIGINT is the catalyst for collecting on someone, then that can become a problem if the authority to collect on that person doesn't already exist without it.
Yeah, and just in the scenario that I'm talking about, it's the collection's already occurred. FINTRAC might just be using SIGINT to help triage existing intelligence. But again, lots of hypotheticals there.
No, just I would say that one of the things that you and I and probably Leah have been talking about quite a bit is the capacity of the system, that we've put in place a lot of the legal frameworks to do things, but we just don't do them, or we don't do them well or as efficiently as we can. I think you've pointed out to a large extent, and you just mentioned FinTrack and their kind of suspicious transaction reporting, and that information is then given on to the RCMP. But we see very, very few cases involving financial crimes coming out of the RCMP as a result of this. So, how are you feeling about some of the enforcement of all of this?
The way I would frame this is that I don't think that we've got a money laundering and organized crime intelligence problem in Canada. I think we have an enforcement one. So if you look at the actual disclosures that FinTrack has made to law enforcement on suspected money laundering, there are well over 10,000 of those. Now that could be a single transaction. It could be
Sorry, 10,000 since when? Like in a
since
year?
yeah, since 2015, we've been in the 1,500 to just a little over 2,000 disclosures a year for suspected money laundering activity in Canada. Now, that could be like a single transaction. So, a single suspicious transaction report could constitute a disclosure. It could also be tens of thousands of transactions in a single disclosure. And we also know that, well, we estimate that it's probably the illicit economy in Canada is probably around 50 billion in terms of money laundering activities. There's a lot to unpack in terms of those estimates, but it's a really big thing. We know a lot about it though. Where I think we're falling down is on that enforcement piece. There's a number of reasons for that. Financial crimes investigations and, organized crime is a lot about financial crimes and a lot about money laundering. These are really lengthy investigations. They require a high level expertise. You're almost certainly going to have forensic accountants involved to unpack this because, the bad guys, the cartels are using forensic accountants to hide this money. They're using lawyers, they're using accountants, they're using company formation agents, they're using everything to hide this money. So we have to bring similar tools to bear to unpack it. And the problem is in Canada is we really haven't sustained attention, resources, and skills in this area. What tends to happen in federal policing is that we establish different financial crimes units. There's been a series of them that have happened over the course of the last 10 years or so. But then whenever there's a new priority, if it's foreign interference, if it's borders, we tend to pull people from the financial crimes section to do other things because it is hard to get that sustained attention on those investigations to bring them to conclusion.
Jess, can you just explain how and why financial crimes are linked to this fentanyl problem or the illegal crossing problem that Trump seems or alleges to be concerned with?
Yeah, so fentanyl producers are obviously making money. You can't just deposit that money into a bank and say, this is my money. I'm going to buy a house. I'm going to do all these kinds of things with it. What you have to do is you actually have to launder that money. So you have to pretend that it came from some other source of funds. So FinTrack actually released an operational alert on all the different typologies that are involved in fentanyl money laundering in Canada. That was actually cited in one of Trump's executive orders, although miscited, I would say. And so the money laundering and the financial crimes that are involved in that are really the end result of the activities. There's also a number of trade related money laundering techniques that are used to move the actual precursor chemicals into Canada and hide the shipment of goods and all of those kinds of things. So that's sort of how it connects.
Is there a belief that, you know, cartels in Mexico who might have a limited footprint in Canada are actually doing more of this kind of laundering in Canada? Or are we expecting that it's just those in Canada who are producing here that are engaged in that practice?
Yeah, I think there's two different answers to that question. I think the evidence of significant cartel activity in Canada from a money laundering perspective is fairly limited in terms of, actual prosecutions, disruptions. But I have definitely heard a lot of concerns that that's happening. And that's what part of what that big TD fine was about was like, in the United States in particular, they had people facilitating money laundering activities on behalf of drug trafficking organizations, and similar sort of lapses in compliance were happening in Canada, not to the same extent. But that's sort of the concern. And when you look at FinTrack's website and all the different typologies that they've been able to produce about professional money laundering in Canada and money laundering activities writ large, I think it paints a pretty grim picture of what's actually likely happening on the ground, and in contrast to the publicly available information.
So this kind of, I think, brings me to the next kind of topic. that, the actual groups that are doing these things, the cartels. Uh, we're now going to list these cartels as terrorist organizations. This mirrors, of course, something that Trump did, I think, within his first week of office. He declared all the drug cartels to be terrorist organizations. I don't know how that's actually played out on their foreign terrorist entities list yet, but I suspect that'll be something we see sometime soon. So we're going to do that as well. This is our terrorism listing process, of course. Jess, you've written about this. Leah, you've written about this as well. So what do we make of this? I mean, is cartel even a legal term? I'm not. How would you even know what a cartel is? So I would be curious as to your take on how any of that's going to work.
I mean, cartel is no more of a definitive term than like terrorist group, right? Or whatever. It's a colloquial term meant for a bunch of people who like gang, right? So they will name specific cartels, presumably those most prominent in Mexico, dealing with fentanyl trafficking under Canada's criminal code. Now, to list an entity under the criminal code, there's a couple of different criteria, right? First, the entity has to have, as part of its purpose, it doesn't have to be its raison d'etre, terrorist activity. And terrorist activity has three parts to it, which includes significant violence or threats of violence against people or groups of people or politicians in government for a political, ideological, or religious purpose. So, if you think about what we watch on TV about cartels, because this is literally my only exposure to cartels, right? Do I see examples of cartels engaged in such things like kidnappings and political assassinations in order to get government officials to comply with what they want or intimidate what they want in a politically advantageous way? Yes. Is that normally what we think of for political reasoning, right? When we think political, religious, or ideological? No. But to be honest, I've done a deep dive into what political means in this context, and it's not very clear. So I don't think it's that big of a stretch to say that many cartels also engage in terrorist activity to further their cartel business.
That makes sense.
Right? But it's not, again, they don't live for the terrorism.
Whereas we have seen terrorist movements also use organized crime in order to facilitate their ends. But I think I'm stepping into Jess territory now.
Yeah, let's not get out over our skis here.
Okay.
I think Leah's example is exactly it, because we see this all the time with Mexican cartels, that they engage in political assassinations. They engage in targeted violence against populations, specifically to instill fear. So like we've very easily met the low threshold for terrorist entities in this country. The very sophisticated analysis I shared on Blue Sky yesterday was that it's icky but lawful to list them as terrorist organizations in this way. It's icky mostly in my view because, it's unpleasant to have a foreign government tell us what we should and shouldn't do in terms of our domestic listings process. But there's not really any reason why we can't list them. So we'll likely see the government listing the Jalisco, Gulf, and Sinaloa cartels as terrorist entities specifically. I think there's a couple of things that get a bit more interesting is if we try to start listing domestic organized crime groups. Like, are we going to see the Rock Machine or the Hells Angels listed as terrorist entities in this country?
That could get really messy really fast.
Right, because Jalisco, Gulf, Sinaloa, they're not coming to Canada to challenge these listings. Other players that have a Canadian footprint have the potential to. I know Leah will probably want to come in on this and talk about the feasibility of that.
No, not really. I think the idea that any of these groups are going to seek judicial review of a terrorist entity listing is unlikely. I think the interesting thing is that it's not a list for the sake of listing, right? Or it shouldn't be at least. Like, we should never be listing for the sake of listing, because listing imposes a bunch of obligations and prohibitions on other people, especially financial institutions, right? So it's not like there's no harm, no foul when you put another person on the list, right? It creates work, auditing requirements, potentially requires the freezing of assets on a variety of different financial institutions when an entity is listed. And it also makes it a crime to provide any kind of support, like physical support, like I drove you to the airport, or monetary support, like here's $20. It makes it out a crime, right, to provide support to a terrorist group, right? It also becomes a crime to provide services, right? Like you can't provide car pickup services to a terrorist organization, right? You're providing a service to a terrorist group, illegal. So the listing creates second and third order effects on people in Canada. And that's supposed to be the point of the listing. So there will be people that once there's a list, people, organizations, businesses that now have due diligence requirements and obligations that if they do not comply with are criminal offenses.
Yeah, like, I mean, I think this is worth pointing out these cartels that we're going to see listed. I wonder if the heads of these cartels could be listed as well as just, the
Sure, but I
entities
don't
that they
really
are a
think that
part of.
gets you very far. The thing that makes me a bit concerned is like the low level producer or drug runner or name your low level
The
person.
18-year-old who's trying to feed his family,
Right.
who
So
is
now
smuggling
instead of
drugs.
just being liable for criminal offenses related to, you know, the to drugs or regular criminal code offenses, you're now potentially capturing them under the terrorism regime.
Maybe we'll get more terrorist financing prosecutions now.
More than one.
I do want to talk about the problems that are inherent with having Trump tell us who we should and shouldn't designate as terrorists or list as terrorist entities. Because in this case, he's telling us that we should list cartels that clearly meet the threshold of terrorist entities. And really, like, we can squint and we're like, okay, that's not great, but whatever, it's not that big a deal. What if he comes to us and says, I want you to list Antifa or another group that we would consider to be a legitimate protest group? In a lot of cases, these entities could meet the definition of terrorist entity in Canada. The other problem I see it, is that Canada has not been particularly stringent in terms of applying our own criteria to listing terrorist entities. We saw the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps vote in the House of Commons, which preceded its listing. And I think that, Leah and I have had this conversation in lawfare, I think it was, about whether or not that's even consistent with our criminal code provisions. And so all of this opens, I think, a very bad Pandora's box of potential implications down the road.
Yeah, just to make it clear for those who are not familiar with the listings process, this is not something that has to be proved in a court of law beyond a reasonable doubt, right? This is something that those criteria that I mentioned before, the minister reasonably believes have been met. And they don't need to be met repeatedly. It could be a single instance. And if you look at a lot of the justifications for various entities that are listed in Canada, public safety has on their website, often it's only a single instance of violence that is used to justify that. And sometimes that's just using good open source information, and they don't want to get into the details. But again, it's not a high bar to list someone. You don't need to prove something occurred and someone was responsible beyond a reasonable doubt to list an entity. And it is not an independent or impartial decision to list. It is a decision made by elected officials.
So what do you guys think? Do you think that my concern around this is overblown?
I can't help but feel that, like, one day all this is going to bite us somehow, right? The ingredients, I feel, are there in some way to create a little bit of chaos. Like, I do wonder, we have seen, for example, in US news, a lot of discussion on MS-13, right? Which is, again, a criminal gang, and kind of describing them as terrorists. And I don't want to, like, make them look like nice guys. Like, they're clearly, for lack of a better term, bad dudes who commit a lot of crimes and kill a lot of people, right? But I
With
mean,
really aggressive face tats.
right, exactly. But it's like, when you start listing everything as a terrorist organization, I think the term loses meaning, to a certain extent. And that's not great, I think, for terrorism prosecutions, terrorism law. And then I think also I do worry about this idea that we are securitizing often what is a health issue, like fentanyl and things like this. Fentanyl is a health issue, and we've seen a lot of campaigning to treat drug addiction as a health issue as opposed to a security issue. And I think listing these organizations as terrorist organizations may be in some ways the opposite of that. I'm not saying these organizations are nice or we should handle them with kid gloves and we should get everyone like some hospital treatment and things like this, but like that's clearly not the case. These are bad people, but I just don't see how this really helps. Yes, it is a blunt instrument, but I just feel like there's other things that we can do in the terrorist listings process, as you both have just stated quite eloquently, is often performative rather than functional.
So if we go back to this again, the justification for all of this is the fentanyl problem in the United States, right? We do have a fentanyl problem in Canada, and Trump is taking a global war on terror on drugs approach. GWAT on drugs. I think there is no reason to believe that that is an effective approach to dealing with an opioid epidemic, right? And we are basically saying, yep, we agree that this is how this should be dealt with. And we're putting money to a war on drugs approach rather than a public health approach to this problem that we have in Canada. And
exactly,
that is not the best use of resources for handling this problem in Canada. And I would say that Trump's approach is not going to be all that successful in the United States either. But I think if we go back to the root and say, yeah, their fentanyl is a problem, the proposed solution out of this deal, quote unquote deal, is not necessarily the best one for resolving that problem.
So I think we're going to end it here. Obviously, this isn't going to be the end of the conversation. We never know. In 30 days, Trump, we may be having a tariff war all over again to add to the war on terror, the war on drugs. And so I just want to thank you for answering some of the questions that I had about these new announcements / old announcements, kind of wrapped up as new announcements. And for our listeners, I'm sure we'll be talking about this. And just a reminder, if you are enjoying Secure Line, we're a new podcast. We're trying to promote ourselves. So please tell a friend, rate and review, share on social media. And we hope to hear from you soon. And we'll be back. Leah, Jess, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye.